Welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. There will be spoilers in this review, which for this book is kind of a big deal. This is probably one of the most complex books I've read in a while. There's a lot going on. It's operating on a lot of different levels. At times it kind of made me feel like an idiot, to be honest. It's quite a challenging read, but at the same time, and for many of the same reasons, it's an incredibly rewarding read, and I will try my best to break down all of the many fascinating and interesting things that are going on here. The first thing I want to bring up, just because it's more of an aside than anything, is how deliberately this book evokes the writing of Jorge Luis Borges, one of my favorite writers of all time. Check out my Ficciones video on this channel. For starters, it has Borges's classic framing device where the story we're reading is supposedly a rare medieval manuscript that has survived only through a bizarre chain of copies and translations, and Umberto Eco, as the narrator, claims that he merely found and reconstructed the text. So before the novel even starts, we're already questioning whether this manuscript is authentic, whether it's been mistranslated, whether it even existed in the first place. Just very Borges thing to do. The book itself, in a meta sense, is already a literary mystery. Then on top of that, this story is filled with libraries and labyrinths and secret codes and forbidden books. It really does feel like an expanded version of any number of Borges stories that I've read. And then there's the most obvious reference of all. One of the main characters is a blind librarian named Jorge of Burgos. As a big Borges fan, I appreciated all of these little references, and I just wanted to bring that up before getting into the rest of the weeds. So like I said, there's this external meta frame of the mysterious manuscript, but that's really just the prologue only. The manuscript itself is what the vast majority of the novel consists of, and it is likewise really interesting. This is historical fiction set in a 14th century Italian monastery. It's a period piece from a very old period in a very specific place, and you can tell that Umberto Eco put the work in to make it feel as authentic as possible in terms of the historical events, the theology, philosophy, politics, architecture, just daily monastic life, even the way people think and speak. On a broad level, the story centers around two men. There's Adso of Melk, a young Benedictine novice who is writing this manuscript decades later and narrating the story in the first person, and William of Baskerville, an incredibly enlightened Franciscan friar, former inquisitor, and sort of proto-detective. Given the hyper-religious world he inhabits, William is remarkably rational, empirical, skeptical, almost secular in the way that he approaches problems. So much so that I almost found him to be a bit anachronistic at times, like so ahead of his time ideologically. But Eco does a good job of referencing the real philosophers of the time, like Roger Bacon, that William is drawing from. These two arrive at an abbey, which is a specific type of self-governing monastery, to investigate the mysterious death of one of the monks, Adelmo, who appears to have fallen from the library tower under suspicious circumstances. So running alongside the murder mystery is a huge political subplot between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope over what's known as the poverty of Christ, which is the question of whether Jesus and the apostles owned property. A delegation from both sides is about to meet at the abbey, and William has come as a part of the imperial delegation to help defend the Franciscan position. The clever thing is that this isn't really a debate about whether Jesus owned like a tunic or a purse or whatever. It's more of a proxy battle over who should wield power in medieval Europe. If Christ and the apostles truly renounced all property, then many Franciscans like William argued the church should do the same, which undermines the Pope's claims to vast wealth and authority. The emperor naturally likes this position because it weakens papal influence over kings and governments. The Pope, meanwhile, rejects it because accepting Franciscan poverty could call into question the legitimacy of the church's immense political and economic power. So even though it's framed as this obscure theological argument, it gradually reveals itself to be a struggle over the relationship between church and state, the relationship between spiritual authority versus political authority, where both sides are accusing the other of this eternally damning heresy. So in and around this complicated spiderweb, Umberto Eco inserts a whole big ensemble cast of characters, and the story plays out over the course of 7 days, essentially like an Agatha Christie novel, where each morning someone from the abbey is found dead, and with each death, William and Adso have to gather clues and figure out who is responsible for all this and how they're doing it and why. The next day, after Adelmo apparently throws himself from the library tower, the translator Venantius is found dead in a vat of pig's blood. Then the next day, Berengar, the assistant librarian, is discovered drowned in the monastery baths. Later, the herbalist Severinus is murdered in his laboratory. Then Malachi, the librarian, collapses after apparently poisoning himself. And eventually even the abbot himself dies. These events, of course, all happen over the course of hundreds of pages, but that's the loose skeleton of it. Every death seems connected somehow, but every new clue they find makes the mystery more and more confusing. Very early on, William becomes convinced that the answer lies somewhere inside the Abbey's enormous library. The problem is that the library is completely off limits, only the librarian and his assistant are allowed inside, and the abbot even insists that some parts of it must never be entered under any circumstances whatsoever. So naturally, William and Adso begin sneaking in at night. The library is one of the coolest settings I've encountered in a novel, to be honest. It is a literal labyrinth designed to confuse intruders. This is what I meant by intentional Borges influence. There's even a map of it in the back in case you get confused or lost, which I did very easily and very frequently. Every room is marked with these cryptic inscriptions and geographical clues that have to be deciphered like a giant puzzle. Hidden mechanisms open secret passages. There are misleading routes that send you in circles and into dead ends. There are little slits cut into the walls that make the wind from outside sound like the moaning of ghosts. At one point, the two of them even wander into a room filled with some psychoactive smoke that's meant to disorient visitors and convince them they've stumbled into something supernatural, because obviously all the monks believe in that kind of stuff. At the center of the maze lies a forbidden chamber known as the Finis Africae, which everyone keeps hinting at, but nobody will explain. As William pieces things together, it eventually becomes clear that someone is desperately trying to protect a particular book hidden somewhere inside the library. But nobody seems to know exactly what the book is or why it's so dangerous. The way it unfolds is interesting because a lot of the stuff is gleaned in the background, almost in passing. There's something cagey going on in the Abbey that no one is telling Adso or William, who are outsiders. There are monks hiding evidence, they're keeping secrets, they're lying, they're accusing each other. There are historical rivalries or beefs between past librarians about this. And this information all coalesces very slowly and very ambiently, almost separate from William's direct investigation. But as the pieces start falling into place, the murders seem like they are part of this much larger and older conspiracy within the Abbey. The whole grand reveal is kind of perfect because it's nothing completely earth-shattering or mind-blowing, but it's like a perfectly logical and fitting explanation that was appropriately set up throughout the book in a way that is retrospectively satisfying. All the clues were there, you just didn't know what they were pointing toward. It all comes back to Jorge of Burgos, the old blind monk I mentioned earlier. Throughout the story, while everyone else is arguing about the poverty of Christ, Jorge of Burgos keeps getting into these bizarre debates about laughter, like whether laughter is virtuous, whether Christ ever laughed, whether comedy has any place in a Christian life. On the surface, it feels like another totally absurd, esoteric, 14th century theological rabbit hole, but it's something that is nonetheless debated in a very serious manner throughout this book, and it turns out to kind of be the key to everything, because hidden at the literal center of this labyrinthian library is Aristotle's long-lost second book of the Poetics, which is a treatise on comedy and the philosophy of laughter. William likes this kind of stuff. He sees this book in a very positive light. He thinks it's a celebration of laughter's innate humanity, its ability to expose arrogance, to make us question authority. Jorge of Burgos sees exactly the same thing, and that's precisely why he believes it has to be destroyed. His fear is that an argument like this coming from Aristotle, who is a very well-respected philosopher and thinker, will make laughter itself become intellectually respectable. And if that happens, then nothing is beyond ridicule. Not kings, not the church, not even God. Because for Jorge, fear is what holds civilization together, and laughter dissolves fear. Once people stop fearing authority, authority begins to crumble. He's essentially afraid that laughter will undermine the entire structure of society. So that's why he went to all this effort to conceal the book for so long, going so far as to coat the pages of the manuscript with poison so that anyone curious enough to read it will have to repeatedly lick their fingers to separate the pages, unknowingly poisoning themselves in the process. It's kind of an ingenious murder weapon because the victims are literally killed by their own desire for knowledge. One thing that's interesting though is that even as William solves the mystery, he realizes he had been wrong about a lot of the details. He had spent days and days constructing this elaborate theory that the murders followed the 7 trumpets of Revelation, when in reality there was never some perfectly ordered apocalyptic master plan. He still reached the truth, but through coincidence and through mistaken assumptions that just so happened to lead him in the right direction. And I think that realization is one of the novel's central ideas, that human beings are desperate to impose patterns on the world, but reality doesn't really work like that. It's messier than that. William never abandons reason or evidence or anything like that, but he becomes much humbler about what reason can actually accomplish. And by the very end, his skepticism has expanded so far that it almost brushes up against skepticism of God himself. He never quite crosses that line. He never says, like, I'm an atheist now, but he openly wonders whether it's even possible that the universe possesses this neat, rational order people insist it does, or whether that's just another comforting pattern we've projected onto it. A pretty heretical notion, if you ask me. This is a very puritanical world in a lot of ways. There's a whole section where Adso just about has a mental breakdown because he has sex with a girl. So it's a pretty remarkably modern conclusion for a novel set in the 1300s, and I think that's what makes this entire book so compelling. On one hand, it's a detective novel, historical fiction, whodunit, but at the same time, it's like a reflection on faith and doubt and the pursuit of knowledge and the limits of human understanding. It sounds cliche, but this book really is a labyrinth. It can be a bit obtuse at times, but it's endlessly fascinating and one of the most rewarding books I've read in a while. It's a combination of this amazing world building, how you get such verisimilitude with the 13th century monastery, which is a very unique concept in fiction, but in addition to that, a story that is so interpretable and layered and intricate. It's the closest a book has ever come to feeling like I completed a literal puzzle. I do think Umberto Eco is some sort of savant, which both contributes to this book's difficulty, but also contributes to its profound depth. Very much a one-of-a-kind reading experience. I would give this book a strong 8.